Today, we're going to talk about sin. Doesn't that sound fun? Hey everyone, welcome to Sunday School Shorts. I know that for some people, today's going to be a tough topic. The concept of sin can produce a whole range of thoughts and emotions. And I get it. As soon as I say the word sin, you might have started throwing all sorts of labels on me. I may have instantly transformed in your mind as one of those people who stands on street corners with signs and yell at others. I can assure you I'm not that. So before you hit that X button, hit the unsubscribe, or block me on Twitter, just hear me out. Because although you may not agree with me, I think we function better as a people and a society when we sit down and actually listen to others who disagree with us, rather than surrounding ourselves with others who only affirm our viewpoints. When discussing the scriptures, there's no way around sin. The Bible uses the word and derivations of it over 800 times. That's not even including other words that communicate a similar concept, such as transgressions, iniquities, or trespasses. So if we're going to be honest with what the Bible talks about, we have to talk about sin. Alright, if you're still with me, today we're going to continue to look at the gospel of Jesus Christ from an on-the-ground perspective. Last time we talked about God. More specifically, we talked about His transcendence and His godness, but also His closeness and His immanence. So if you haven't seen that video yet, I encourage you to check it out because I'm going to be using that as a backdrop for today's content. But before we continue, that's right, it's time to take a look at the lesson plan. First, we're going to look at the garden once again to see the origins of sin. Then we'll examine how that impacts us today. Finally, we'll close with what that has to do with our relationship with God. We've been spending a lot of time camping out in Genesis 1-3 lately, and we're going to start there once again. But here's the TLDR version. God had made the man Adam and the woman Eve and declared them to be very good. He placed them in the Garden of Eden to work and to keep it, and nothing was off limits for them to enjoy, except for the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. However, Adam and Eve did not listen to God and did indeed partake of the fruit which brought forth sin. This act of disobedience transformed human beings' relationship with God and imputed unto us a sinful nature. Instead of desiring to please God, we instead only desire to please ourselves. Martin Luther, the 16th century reformer, would describe the human heart as incurvatus in se, or curved in on itself. We became corrupt, our hearts became sick, our programming had been infected with a virus. This is known as the doctrine of original sin. Because of Adam's transgressions, all mankind would enter the world with a sinful nature and would be guilty before God. During the 4th century, a man named Pelagius would argue that Adam's fall into sin actually had no direct influence on the condition of men, but instead Adam had only set a bad example for those who would come after him. The church would condemn Pelagius as a heretic at the Council of Chalcedon in 431 AD, and rightly so. The Bible is rife with language that teaches that we aren't sinners because we sin, but we sin because we are sinners, that we do certain things because of a distorted and corrupt nature within ourselves. Here are just a few examples. Jeremiah 17:9 says, "The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick. Who can understand it?" In Psalm 51, in a prayer of repentance by King David, the king of Israel would pen, "Behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me." David was not accusing his mother of sinful behavior that resulted in his conception, but instead was acknowledging that he had inherited a sinful nature as soon as he came into existence. Jesus would also say in Matthew 15, "For out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false witness, slander." And Romans 5 is also saturated with this type of language. Verse 12 says, "Therefore just as sin came into the world through one man, that being Adam, and death through sin, and so death spread to all men because all sinned." And then in verse 18, "Therefore as one trespass led to condemnation for all men." And verse 19, "For as by the one man's disobedience the many were made sinners." And this is where many of us will want to shut the book. No one likes confronting their own darkness or mistakes. It can feel like an assault or attack on who we are. And truthfully, it is. But in order to grow as people, we first have to identify our weaknesses, flaws, and problems. And we have a sin problem. Even if you want to disagree with me on this, that's fine. You're free to do so. But you gotta admit, we've all done things that we shouldn't have done, or have not done things that we should have done. If you think I'm coming hard at you right now, then buckle up. The Bible's portrayal not only of our nature, but also our relationship with God is far worse. Romans 8 and Colossians 1 would say that in our sinful nature, we are hostile to God. Romans 5 would call us enemies of God. John 8:34 and Romans 6:20 would say that we are enslaved to our sin. And if that's not enough, Ephesians 2 would say that we are actually dead in our sin, not just sick, but flatlined, 6 feet in the grave. Remember the warning to Adam and Eve to not eat of the fruit, for in the day that you eat of it you shall surely die? Physical death came, but so did spiritual death. Everywhere around us, it's the walking dead. Back off, MJ. So this has radically altered our standing before God. But isn't God a God of love? Can't He just forgive us? Well, yes and no. Remember what we talked about last time. God is so unlike us in His godness. He is perfect in His essence and in His being. So in all of His attributes, He is perfect. He is perfectly good, perfectly loving, perfectly righteous, and perfectly just. Because of this, He can't simply forgive us by looking the other way. Any judge that does this should be removed from their bench and stripped of their robe and wig. Side note, did you know that a judge's wig is called a peruke? I had no idea. Thanks, Google. Anyways, righteousness and justice must be upheld and sin has to be punished. But why? What's the big deal with sin? Most of us are probably thinking on a human level and not trying to see it from God's perspective. King David would also say in Psalm 51, which we mentioned a little bit earlier, "Against you, you only have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight." That's nice, King David, except you slept with one of your neighbors, possibly using your kingly privilege to get your way, got her pregnant, and then tried to cover it up by having their actual true husband come back from war to sleep with said wife, and then when he refused, you had him rush back to the front lines where he would be killed. Yikes. But in David's prayer, he says, "Against you, you only have I sinned." What about the neighbor Bathsheba? What about her husband? What about the child to be born? What about the nation of Israel, who he was to rule and reign in righteousness? Yes, David failed in all these ways as well, and it's in David's failure to love his neighbor as himself, no pun intended, that he failed and sinned ultimately against God. And while we probably haven't done something as extreme as David, maybe we lie here or there and have an occasional outburst of anger. It's called a turn signal. Use it. It doesn't matter if it's a small sin or not. It's the who we are sinning against. If I get in a scuffle with my brother, that's one thing. But if I were to spear tackle the president, what's that? That's too political? Okay, fine. If I were to spear tackle who's someone significantly of more importance, Dolly Parton, then a greater punishment should be administered. Don't worry, Dolly, I would never. But sin against God is a sin against an infinite and eternal being. He's the king of everything, and we're violating this king's decrees. So the only proper response for the king's righteousness and justice and holiness being assaulted against is infinite and eternal punishment. And look, I don't tell you all this to be a Debbie Downer or to do this from some superior position that says I'm better than you. All of humanity is in the same boat, from the worst of sinners to the saintliest saint. Romans 3:10 says, "None is righteous, no, not one." Verse 23 says, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." Look, it is of no advantage for me to tell you these things. I know that people don't like this message, and I understand. On some fundamental level, we all don't like others telling us what to do. We all have issues with submitting to authority, but we also submit to varying degrees of authority all the time. Most of us don't blatantly violate traffic laws, like say drive on the wrong side of the road or go 150 miles an hour through a school zone. Again though, blinkers, use them. But if God is the creator God and we are his creatures, then he is the one with all authority and he decides what is right and what is wrong. So when it comes to what is sin, it's violating the king's commands. Alright, on that rosy note, it's time for snack time, the part of the show where I leave you with questions to chew on. Today those questions are, do you see yourself as a sinner? In what ways do you have issues with authority? Where does that show up in your life? And finally, exactly what should we do with our sin problem? I want to close today with yet another quote from Dr. John Piper, where he gave a heightened definition of sin in relation to God's attributes. He says, quote, "What is sin? The glory of God not honored, the holiness of God not reverenced, the greatness of God not admired, the power of God not praised, the truth of God not sought, the wisdom of God not esteemed, the beauty of God not treasured, the goodness of God not savored, the faithfulness of God not trusted, the promises of God not believed, the commandments of God not obeyed, the justice of God not respected, the wrath of God not feared, the grace of God not cherished, the presence of God not prized, the person of God not loved. That is sin. All right, that's all I have for today. Today's topic certainly is a heavy one, and I don't want to ruin that feeling we all get when we are personally confronted with our sin problem. That feeling is a good feeling, and it's meant to push us towards God. So I'm going to spare you with all the like, share, and subscribe talk that normally ends these videos, but I do just want to thank y'all for being here and for all your support. Tune in next time because the message is about to get a whole lot better. As always, thanks for watching and take care.